The late afternoon sun slanted through the terminal windows at JFK Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases and half-finished coffees, voices blending into a steady hum of announcements, chatter, and the occasional wail of a tired child. Among them, two young women moved with quiet purpose. They wore jeans, comfortable sneakers, and light jackets, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention. One carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. The other held a paperback novel she'd just bought at the gate shop. They looked like any other pair of sisters catching a cross-country flight. Maybe heading home after a weekend visit or a quick work trip. What most people didn't realize, what the bustling crowd certainly didn't notice, was that these two had once lived in the most famous house in America. Years had passed since their family left the White House, and they'd grown into thoughtful, grounded adults who valued privacy more than spotlight. They weren't traveling with a motorcade or a team of aides. Just two sisters, a discreet security detail blending into the background, and a desire to get to Los Angeles without fuss. They checked in quietly, showed their IDs, and walked through security like everyone else, though the agents gave them a respectful nod, recognizing them instantly but saying nothing. On the other side, they paused near a quiet corner to wait for boarding. One scrolled through messages on her phone while the other sipped from a water bottle, glancing out at the tarmac where their plane sat, its wings catching the golden light. When their group was called, they boarded without fanfare. The flight was nearly full, but business class had a few empty seats. They'd booked adjacent window and aisle seats, plenty of room to stretch out, read, or nap during the long flight. The cabin was calm, the kind of hushed space where people lowered their voices instinctively. A flight attendant greeted them with a warm smile, checked their boarding passes, and gestured toward their row. "Welcome aboard," she said, her tone professional but friendly. They settled in. One tucked her backpack under the seat, adjusted the blanket folded neatly on her chair, and slipped on noise-canceling headphones. The other opened her book, already halfway through. Outside, ground crew gave the final signals. The cabin door closed with a soft thud. Engines rumbled to life, low and steady, like a deep breath before a long journey. A few rows behind them, a man in a crisp navy suit stood in the aisle, frowning at his boarding pass. He'd checked in late, upgraded at the gate, and expected more. His seat was in the last row of business class, next to the galley, near the curtain that separated premium from economy. He'd paid extra for this, he reminded himself, and he wasn't about to spend 6 hours squeezed beside the restroom. He glanced around. The cabin was mostly full, but he spotted 2 empty seats near the front, window and middle in row 3. Perfect. He strode toward the front, his leather briefcase swinging slightly at his side. "Excuse me," he said, stopping near the lead flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with neatly pinned hair and a name tag that read, Claire. His voice was polite but edged with impatience. "I just boarded and my seat assignment seems off. I'm a Platinum Elite member, and I was told I'd be upgraded to a forward cabin seat. This one's practically in coach." Claire smiled, though her eyes flickered with mild concern. She checked her tablet. "Sir, I see you were upgraded to 12A, which is indeed in business class. All forward seats were assigned at check-in based on availability. But those seats up there, row 3, are empty," he said, nodding toward the front. "Why can't I move there?" Claire hesitated. "Those seats are already assigned to passengers who boarded earlier." "Are they on board?" he pressed. She glanced toward row 3. "Yes, they are." "Then ask them to switch," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I'm sure they wouldn't mind moving back a few rows for someone who needs the space. I've got an important call to make once we're airborne, and I need the quiet." Claire's smile tightened. She knew the request wasn't unusual. Airlines often shuffled passengers for upgrades, especially for high-tier flyers. But something about his tone, the assumption that others would happily give up their spot, made her pause. Still, she'd been trained to keep customers satisfied, especially those who flash status like a badge. She walked slowly toward the front of the cabin, her shoes silent on the carpet. Row 3, 2 young women. One with headphones on, eyes on her book. The other looking out the window, calm, composed. They didn't look like trouble. They didn't look like VIPs, just ordinary travelers who'd paid for a comfortable seat. Claire stopped beside them. "Hi there," she said softly so as not to startle them. I'm so sorry to bother you, but we have a passenger who was upgraded last minute and doesn't have a suitable seat in the forward cabin. Would you be willing to switch to 2 seats we have open in row 8? Same class, same service, just a little farther back. The one with the book lowered it slowly. She looked at Claire, then at her sister. There was no anger in her eyes, just quiet surprise. We're fine here, she said evenly. We booked these seats specifically so we could sit together without being disturbed. I understand, Claire said quickly, and I really appreciate your flexibility. It's just for one passenger, and it would make a big difference for him. The other sister turned now, pulling one headphone off. Her voice was gentle but firm. There are other empty seats in business, right? Why do we have to move? Claire glanced at her tablet again. Well, yes, but they're not together, and this passenger needs a window or aisle for his work. So he needs convenience, the first sister said. But we don't? It wasn't accusatory, just a simple observation. But it landed heavily in the quiet cabin. A few nearby passengers looked up from their phones or magazines. Claire felt a flicker of unease. She hadn't expected pushback. Most people said yes, especially when asked nicely. I'm not trying to cause trouble, she said, lowering her voice further. It's just airline policy to accommodate upgrades when possible. But we paid for these seats too, the second sister replied. And we'd like to keep them. Claire nodded, forcing a smile. Of course, I completely understand. She stepped back, but her mind was racing. The man in the suit was watching from a few rows back, arms crossed. She'd have to tell him no, and she knew how that conversation would go. As she walked away, the sisters exchanged a look. Not angry, not dramatic, just weary. They'd been here before in different forms in different places. The assumption that their space was negotiable, that their comfort was secondary. They didn't say anything more. One put her headphones back on. The other reopened her book. But neither was really reading anymore. Outside, the plane taxied onto the runway. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, running through the safety briefing. Flight attendants took their seats, buckling in with practiced ease. The engines roared louder, building power. The aircraft surged forward, lifting smoothly into the sky, New York shrinking below into a grid of lights and rivers. Up in row 3, the sisters watched the ground disappear. One reached over and squeezed her sister's hand, just for a second. A silent message, we're okay. We're together. Behind them, the man in the suit scowled as Claire explained the situation. He muttered something under his breath, loud enough for the passenger next to him to hear. Unreasonable. After all, I pay. But his words were swallowed by the hum of the jet engines, the rhythm of a flight already in motion. No one else seemed to care. The cabin settled into its mid-air routine. Trays lowered, drinks poured, screens flickering to life. Yet something had shifted. A quiet tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. It wasn't about seats anymore. It was about who gets to be treated with automatic respect, and who has to prove they deserve it even when they've already paid the same price. The sisters didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. They'd learned long ago that dignity isn't given. It's held on to, quietly, firmly, even when others try to take it away with a simple request wrapped in politeness. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the lead flight attendant returned with drink orders. She offered them sparkling water with a slightly strained smile. They accepted politely. No hard feelings, no scene. Just two women choosing peace over performance. But in the back of her mind, Claire wondered if she'd made a mistake. Not because of who they were, she still didn't fully realize, but because of how they carried themselves. With a calm that felt like strength. With a refusal that wasn't rude but resolute. And somewhere over Pennsylvania, as the sun dipped below the clouds, the man in the suit finally gave up pacing the galley and sank into his assigned seat. Still grumbling, the flight would go on. Los Angeles would come into view in a few hours. But what happened in those first 20 minutes, small as it seemed, had already changed the air inside the cabin. Not with noise, not with drama, but with the quiet weight of a question that lingered long after the seatbelt sign turned off. Whose comfort matters most? And more importantly, who gets to decide? The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the steady drone of the engines becoming a familiar backdrop. Flight attendants moved down the aisle with practiced ease, offering drinks and warm towels. Most passengers relaxed into their seats, some scrolling through movies, others closing their eyes, already drifting towards sleep. But in row 3, the air still felt a little tight, like the quiet after someone said something they can't take back. The flight attendant, Claire, had returned to the galley, her mind racing. She replayed the exchange in her head, the way those two young women had looked at her, not with anger, but with something steadier, something that made her feel like she'd missed a detail she should have seen. She shook it off. They were just passengers, maybe a little stubborn, but within their rights. Still, the man in the suit, Mr. Reynolds, according to his boarding pass, was not happy. He stood near the curtain separating business from economy, arms crossed, watching her with narrowed eyes. "So," he said as she passed. "Did they move?" "No, sir," she said, keeping her voice low. "They declined." He let out a short, sharp laugh. "Of course they did. Entitled kids these days don't even know how the real world works." Claire didn't respond. She busied herself with stacking napkins, avoiding his gaze. But his words stuck. "Entitled?" She glanced toward row 3 again. They were reading, talking softly, completely unbothered. If anything, they seemed the opposite of entitled. Calm, polite, minding their own business. But she didn't say that. She'd learned long ago that arguing with passengers rarely ended well, especially ones who believed the rules bent in their favor. Still, she felt uneasy. Something about the situation didn't sit right. She'd been a flight attendant for over a decade. She'd handled everything. Medical emergencies, turbulence, lost luggage, crying toddlers, even a proposal gone wrong when the ring rolled under a seat. But this felt different, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so ordinary. The kind of thing that happened quietly, without witnesses, without consequences, except to the people it happened to. Back in row 3, the sisters weren't thinking about Mr. Reynolds anymore. They'd moved on, like people do when they've learned not to let small injustices steal their peace. One scrolled through photos on her phone. Old family pictures, vacation shots, candid moments that made her smile. The other finished a chapter and marked her page with a receipt from the airport bookstore. But then Claire was back. This time, she approached with a different kind of smile, one that was trying too hard to be friendly. "Hi again," she said, voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I know I asked already, but Mr. Reynolds is a very frequent flyer. He's flown with us over 100 times this year alone. He's got a critical business call once we hit the coast, and he really needs a quieter spot. Would you consider switching just for the sake of keeping things smooth? We'd be so grateful." The sister with the book looked up. "You're asking again?" "I know," Claire said quickly. "And I hate to push, but it would really help us out." The other sister took off her headphones fully now. "Why us?" she asked gently. "There are other empty seats. Even if they're not together, why not offer him one of those?" Claire hesitated. "Because he needs a window or aisle. And the only available pairs are middle and aisle combos. He's particular. So instead of asking him to compromise, the first sister said, "You're asking us to?" Claire didn't answer right away. She glanced around as if hoping someone else would step in or the problem would solve itself. A few passengers nearby were definitely listening now. An older woman in row 4 pretended to read her magazine but kept glancing over. A man across the aisle lowered his tablet slightly. "I'm just trying to do my job," Claire finally said, her voice tight. "And our job," the second sister replied, "is to enjoy the seats we paid for without being treated like we're doing a favor by staying put." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. Mr. Reynolds, who'd been hovering near the galley, now stepped fully into the aisle. "Look," he said, his voice carrying more than it should. "I don't mean to be difficult, but I've earned this. I fly more miles in a month than most people do in a lifetime. A little courtesy shouldn't be too much to ask." The first sister turned to him directly now. "Courtesy goes both ways," she said. "We're not refusing out of spite. We just want to sit where we booked," he scoffed. "It's 2 seats. It's not like you're losing anything." "But we are," she said calmly. "We're losing the choice. The assumption that we'll move just because someone else demands it, that's the part that stings." A beat of silence followed. Even the hum of the engine seemed to quiet for a moment, then a voice from row 4. "You know what? I'll switch." Everyone turned. It was the older woman with the magazine. She stood slowly, smoothing her cardigan. "I'm in 4A window seat. I don't mind moving to 8C if it helps." She looked at Claire, then at Mr. Reynolds. "But only if it's clear this isn't about who deserves better treatment. It's just about making space, Claire blinked, surprised. Oh, thank you, ma'am. That's very kind, Mr. Reynolds nodded, satisfied. See? Not so hard when people cooperate. But the woman held up a finger. Hold on, I'm not switching for him. I'm switching because I believe in sharing when it's fair. But if you think you're entitled to someone else's seat just because you fly a lot, you've missed the point entirely. He opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it. Instead, he gave a tight nod and stepped back. Claire quickly rearranged the seating on her tablet. Mrs. Langley, if you'd like to move to 8C, we'll get your things. The woman gathered her small bag and blanket. As she passed row 3, she gave the sisters a small knowing smile. Some things, she said quietly, shouldn't be negotiable. They nodded back, grateful but not effusive. The moment passed, but the message lingered. Mr. Reynolds took the window seat in row 4 without another word. He pulled out his laptop, plugged in his headset, and began typing aggressively as if punishing the keyboard for the inconvenience. Claire returned to the galley, exhaling deeply. She felt a mix of relief and shame. Relief that the situation hadn't blown up. Shame that she'd assumed the quiet passengers would be the easiest to move, because they were polite, because they weren't loud, because they didn't look like they'd push back. She'd made a judgment. Not a malicious one, maybe, but a real one. And it had almost cost someone their dignity over something as simple as a seat assignment. Meanwhile, in row 3, the sisters sat in silence for a while, not angry, not shaken, just thoughtful. You okay? One asked softly, the other nodded. Yeah, just tired of being the reasonable ones all the time. I know, the first said. Sometimes it feels like we have to be twice as calm just to be treated half as fairly. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. This wasn't new. It was just another day in a world that often asked certain people to shrink so others could stretch out comfortably. A flight attendant came by with dinner menus. The mood in the cabin had settled again, but the energy had shifted. People were more aware, more watchful. The kind of awareness that comes when you realize fairness isn't automatic. It's something people have to choose, moment by moment. As the meal service began, Claire avoided row 3. She let another attendant handle their course. She couldn't face them yet, not after how she'd approached them, not after assuming they'd say yes just because they were quiet. But then, halfway through dinner, one of the sisters walked back toward the galley. Claire's stomach dropped. Was she coming to complain? To ask for a manager? Instead, the young woman stopped a few feet away and said, Hey, can I get a glass of water? And are you okay? Claire looked up startled. Me? You seemed stressed, the sister said simply. Long flight. Tough passengers. I get it. Claire stared at her for a second, then blinked hard. Yeah, she said, voice softer now. It's been a lot, the sister nodded. Flying's hard on everyone. Crew included. She didn't say, You treated us unfairly. She didn't bring up the seat request. She just offered a moment of humanity, unexpected, unearned, and deeply disarming. Claire handed her the water. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Back in her seat, the sister sipped the water and looked out the window at the endless dark sky dotted with stars. Her sister glanced over. What was that about? Just reminding myself, she said, that most people aren't trying to be cruel. They're just trained to see the world a certain way. And you think she'll see it differently now? Maybe, maybe not. But I'd rather believe she can. The plane flew on, cutting through the night. Somewhere over the Midwest, the captain announced light turbulence ahead. Seatbelt signs flickered on. Passengers buckled in. Mr. Reynolds barely looked up from his screen. In row 3, the sisters fastened their seatbelts side by side. No grand speeches. No social media posts. Just two women holding their ground, not with noise, but with presence. With the quiet certainty that their space, their choices, their comfort mattered just as much as anyone else's. And in the galley, Claire stood for a moment with her eyes closed, replaying that simple question, Are you okay? It had undone her more than any complaint ever could. Because kindness, offered freely by someone you've just asked to give up their seat, has a way of showing you exactly who you've been and who you could be. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Meals were cleared. Blankets were tucked in. Screens dimmed. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Not just for Claire, Not just for the sisters, but for everyone who'd witnessed the exchange, however small it seemed. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the loudest. They're the ones where someone says, "No, thank you," with grace, and someone else realizes too late that they should have asked differently. And in the quiet hum of a nighttime flight, that realization was enough. The cabin had settled into that strange limbo of mid-flight, lights low, voices hushed, most passengers lost in their own worlds. Some slept with neck pillows cradling their heads. Others scrolled through movies or tapped quietly on laptops. The occasional clink of ice in a glass, the soft rustle of a blanket being adjusted. These were the only sounds breaking the steady drone of the engines. It should have been peaceful. But in row 3, peace felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. The sisters sat side by side, not speaking much, but not needing to. They'd been through enough together to know when words weren't necessary. One stared out the window at the endless black sky, dotted with stars that seemed close enough to touch. The other traced the edge of her book with her thumb, not reading, just thinking. What lingered wasn't anger, it was something heavier. Disappointment, maybe. Not in the flight attendant, not even in the man in the suit. But in the pattern of it all. The way certain requests always seemed to land on certain people. The way just a small favor often meant, you're expected to yield because you won't make a scene. A few rows back, Mr. Reynolds had finally closed his laptop. He leaned his head against the headrest, eyes closed, but his jaw was still tight. He hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged the tension. To him, the matter was closed, resolved by someone else's generosity, not his own compromise. Then, without warning, he sat up. He turned in his seat, scanning the cabin until his eyes landed on row 3. He didn't speak at first, just watched. Then, as if to himself but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, he muttered, "Some people act like the world owes them special treatment just for existing." The words hung in the air like smoke. The sister by the window didn't look at him, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. Her sister, the one with the book, slowly closed it and set it on her tray table. She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Special treatment?" she said, her voice calm but clear. "We asked for nothing more than what we paid for. Is that special?" He shifted in his seat. "I'm just saying it wouldn't have killed you to be flexible." "Flexibility goes both ways," she replied. "You could have taken an empty seat. You could have waited. You could have asked nicely instead of acting like it was your right." "I did ask nicely," he shot back, though his voice was rising now. "No," she said gently. "You asked through the crew, expecting them to do the uncomfortable part for you. That's not asking. That's assuming." A few passengers turned fully now. The older woman who'd offered her seat, Mrs. Langley, watched from row 8, her expression unreadable but alert. A man across the aisle paused his movie, remote in hand. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, lowering his voice but not enough. "You know what? You're acting like this is some grand injustice. It's 2 seats on a plane. Get over it." The sister didn't flinch. "It's never just about the seats," she said. "It's about who gets to decide whose comfort matters. And every time someone like you assumes people like us will move without question, it adds up," he scoffed. "People like you? What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, not with contempt, but with a kind of tired clarity. "You don't see it," she said finally. "And that's the point." He opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, Claire appeared in the aisle. "Everything all right back here?" she asked, her tone professional but edged with concern. "Fine," Mr. Reynolds said quickly, sinking back into his seat. "Just a misunderstanding." Claire nodded, but her eyes flicked to row 3. The sisters gave her small, neutral looks. No accusation, no plea. Just quiet acknowledgement. She moved on, but her steps were slower now. She'd heard enough. And what she'd heard made her stomach twist, because she'd been part of it. She'd carried his request like it was routine, like it was harmless. She hadn't stopped to consider why those passengers were chosen. Why not the businessman in row 6? Why not the couple in row 5? Why the 2 young women who kept to themselves, who didn't wear flashy clothes or demand attention? Now, standing in the galley, she replayed every word. The sister's quiet "why us?" The way she'd said, "It's never just about the seats." Claire had heard phrases like that before, from friends, from training modules about unconscious bias, but they'd always felt abstract, theoretical. Now they felt real, personal. She leaned against the counter, gripping the edge. Her supervisor had always said, "Keep the cabin calm. Avoid conflict. Make the high-tier flyers happy." But no one ever said, "Protect the dignity of the quiet ones." Back in row 3, the sister spoke softly again. "You didn't have to say anything," the one by the window murmured. "I know," her sister replied. "But sometimes silence feels like agreement." They both knew the cost of speaking up, the risk of being labeled difficult or oversensitive. But they also knew the cost of staying silent, the slow erosion of self-respect, the message it sends to everyone watching. It's okay to treat us this way. A few minutes later, a flight attendant brought dessert, warm cookies and fruit cups. She offered them with a warm smile, careful not to let her eyes linger too long on row 3. But as she turned to leave, the sister with the book said, "Hey, thank you for treating us like regular passengers." The attendant paused, surprised. Then she smiled, really smiled. "You are regular passengers," she said, "and you deserve to be treated that way." It was a small moment, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it mattered. As the dessert trays were collected, the cabin began to wind down for the night. Blankets were pulled up. Eye masks appeared. The lights dimmed further. Even Mr. Reynolds had put on his noise-canceling headphones, finally retreating into his own bubble. But the tension hadn't vanished. It had just gone quiet, like a hum beneath the surface. Then from row 5, a man cleared his throat. He'd been reading a newspaper the old-fashioned way, pages rustling softly. Now he folded it and looked toward the front. "I've been flying this route for years," he said, his voice calm but carrying, "and I've never once seen someone asked to give up their seat for an upgrade unless they volunteered. That's not policy. That's preference." A woman in row 6 nodded. "I noticed that too. They always seem to ask the same kind of people." No one named who the same kind of people were. They didn't have to. Claire, standing near the rear galley, felt her face grow warm. She wanted to disappear. But she also felt something else, a strange sense of relief. Because someone had said it out loud. Not angrily, not dramatically, just... Truthfully, the sisters didn't respond. They didn't need to. The cabin had spoken for them. Later, as the flight attendants prepared for the overnight service, Claire found herself lingering near row 3 during a routine walkthrough. She didn't stop, didn't speak, but as she passed, she met the eyes of the sister in the aisle seat and gave the tiniest nod. Not an apology, not an excuse, just an acknowledgement. "I see it now." The sister nodded back. No words, just understanding. Hours passed. The plane crossed into mountain time. Outside, the world was dark except for the occasional cluster of city lights far below, tiny constellations of human life. Inside, most passengers slept, but the sisters stayed awake, watching the night unfold beyond the window. One finally broke the silence. "Do you think he'll ever get it?" Her sister sighed. "Maybe, maybe not. But it's not our job to make him understand." "No," the first agreed. "Our job is just to keep showing up as ourselves, calm, clear, and unshaken." They both knew this wouldn't make headlines. There'd be no viral video, no public apology, no grand reckoning. Just a quiet moment on a red-eye flight that would fade from memory for most people by morning. But for them, and for a few others on board, it would stick. Because dignity isn't always defended with shouts. Sometimes it's held in the space between no and thank you, in the refusal to move when asked unfairly, in the choice to offer kindness even after being treated as an inconvenience. And in the end, that's what remained. Not the conflict, but the quiet strength it revealed. The plane hummed on, carrying its passengers through the night, each with their own story, their own burdens, their own moments of choice. And somewhere over Colorado, as the stars wheeled overhead, the sisters finally leaned back, closed their eyes, and let the rhythm of the flight carry them toward rest. They hadn't won anything flashy, but they'd kept something far more valuable: their peace, their unity, and the unspoken promise that they wouldn't let small injustices make them small themselves. And in a world that often asks certain people to shrink, that kind of quiet resilience is its own kind of victory. The cabin was quiet now, wrapped in the soft hush of late-night flight. Most passengers were asleep, heads tilted against windows, blankets pulled up to their chins, the occasional soft snore blending with the steady hum of the engines. Even Mr. Reynolds had finally dozed off, his earlier tension replaced by the slack-jawed stillness of someone who'd argued himself into exhaustion. The flight attendants moved like shadows down the aisle, checking seatbelts, dimming stray reading lights, making sure everyone was settled for the long stretch over the Rockies. In row 3, the sisters had dozed off too, lulled by the rhythm of the plane and the relief of having held their ground without drama. One leaned slightly against the window, her breathing slow and even. The other had her head back, eyes closed, one hand resting on the armrest between them. Their quiet way of staying connected, even in sleep. Then, a new sound cut through the calm. Not loud. Not alarming. Just the soft thunk of the rear cabin door opening, followed by the murmur of voices near the galley. A few passengers stirred. Claire, who'd been folding blankets in the back, looked up and froze. A man stepped into the cabin. He moved with a kind of calm certainty that didn't need announcement. No flashy clothes, no entourage. Just a dark coat, a small carry-on, and the kind of presence that made people look twice without knowing why. He paused just inside the curtain, scanning the rows with quiet familiarity. When his eyes landed on row 3, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Claire's breath caught. She knew that face. Everyone did. But seeing him here on a regular commercial flight alone late at night felt surreal, like spotting a character from a history book walking through your kitchen. He walked forward slowly, not rushing, not drawing attention. Passengers who were awake blinked, did a double take, then quickly looked away, unsure whether to acknowledge him or pretend they hadn't noticed. But he didn't seem to care either way. His focus was clear. He stopped at row 3. The sisters stirred at the same time, as if sensing his presence before they saw him. One opened her eyes first, then the other. For a heartbeat, there was just silence, 3 people recognizing each other in the dim light, no words needed. Then the older sister smiled. "You made it." He nodded, a small, tired smile of his own. "Barely. Traffic was a nightmare. Thought I'd missed the flight entirely." He turned slightly, glancing at the empty middle seat between them. "Mind if I—" They both shifted without hesitation, making room. He slid in smoothly, stowing his bag under the seat, shrugging off his coat. It was such a normal thing. Father joining his daughters on a flight, and yet in that moment it felt charged with something deeper. Because everyone around them now knew. Not because he'd announced it. Not because anyone shouted. But because the way the sisters looked at him, the ease, the quiet affection, said everything. And the way he carried himself, even in exhaustion, carried a weight that couldn't be faked. Claire stood frozen near the galley, her mind racing. Oh no, no. She replayed every interaction from the past hour. The seat request, the second ask. The way she'd assumed they were just 2 young women who wouldn't cause trouble. She hadn't recognized them, not really. And now, seeing them together, it was so obvious she couldn't believe she'd missed it. But worse than that, she'd treated them like any other passengers who could be moved for convenience. And in doing so, she'd revealed something ugly without meaning to. She wanted to vanish. But duty pulled her forward. She took a slow breath and walked toward the front, clipboard in hand, heart pounding. As she approached, the man looked up. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. But it was direct, calm, steady, and utterly aware. "Good evening," he said, his voice low but clear. "Sir?" Claire managed, her voice tighter than she wanted. "Welcome aboard. We weren't expecting you." He nodded. "Last-minute change. My team tried to notify the airline, but I guess it didn't go through." That's all right," she said quickly. "We're honored to have you." He studied her for a moment, then glanced at his daughters. "I heard there was a bit of a situation earlier." Claire's stomach dropped. I'm so sorry if there was any discomfort. We were just trying to accommodate an upgrade request, and you asked my daughters to give up their seats." He finished gently. "Not an accusation. Just a statement," she swallowed. "Yes, sir. I didn't realize who they were." He tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter who they are?" The question hung in the air, simple but heavy. Claire hesitated. "I mean, if I had known, I wouldn't have asked." "But if you had known," he said, "you wouldn't have asked because of who they are. But the real question is, should you have asked at all regardless?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. He leaned forward just slightly, his voice still quiet but firm. "They paid for those seats. They weren't blocking an exit. They weren't causing a disturbance. So why were they the ones asked to move, when other options existed? Claire looked down at her clipboard, her fingers gripping the edge. The passenger was insistent. He's a high-tier flyer. We're trained to prioritize those customers when possible. And what about customers who don't demand attention? He asked. The ones who are polite, who follow the rules, who don't make a scene? Do they count less? She didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, in the rush of service, in the pressure to keep the important passengers happy, she had counted them as easier to move. Not because they were less valuable, but because they seemed less likely to complain. And that, she realized now, was the problem. I made a mistake, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm truly sorry, he nodded slowly. I believe you are, and I appreciate that. But the issue isn't just about my daughters. It's about the pattern, the assumption that certain people will always be the ones to accommodate, because they've been taught to be reasonable, to keep the peace, to not make a fuss. He glanced at his daughters, then back at her. That's not fairness. That's convenience disguised as policy. A few nearby passengers were listening now, though they pretended not to. The older woman from row 8 watched with quiet approval. Even Mr. Reynolds, now awake and hearing the exchange, sank lower in his seat, suddenly very interested in his tray table. Claire felt tears pricking her eyes, not from shame alone, but from the sudden clarity of it all. This wasn't about status. It wasn't about fame. It was about basic respect, and she'd failed to give it, not out of malice, but out of habit. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again, she said. I hope so, he replied. Not just for them, for everyone who boards this plane and expects to be treated like they belong, because they paid their fare just like anyone else. He didn't raise his voice, didn't call for a manager, didn't threaten to go public. He simply stated the truth, and in doing so made it impossible to ignore. Then, as if the moment had passed, he leaned back, turning to his daughters. How's the flight been otherwise? Smooth, one said. Quiet, the other added with the faintest hint of irony. He smiled. Good, let's get some rest. We've got a long day tomorrow. Claire stepped back, murmuring a quiet good night before retreating to the galley. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her clipboard. One of the other attendants gave her a sympathetic look, but didn't say a word. They all knew, and they all understood. In the rows around, a subtle shift occurred. Passengers who'd been half asleep now sat a little straighter. There was a new kind of awareness in the air, not of celebrity, but of principle. People had just witnessed something rare. Power used not to dominate, but to protect. Not to shame, but to teach. Mr. Reynolds stayed silent for the rest of the flight. He didn't apologize, didn't speak to anyone, but he also didn't look up again, as if suddenly aware that the world was watching and judging, not just his actions, but his silence. As the plane crossed into California airspace, the captain announced their descent into Los Angeles. Seatbelt signs flickered on. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, collecting trash, stowing carts, preparing for landing. The man in row 3 helped his daughters gather their things: books, headphones, jackets. There was no fanfare, no special treatment from the crew, now that they knew who he was. And that perhaps was the most telling part. They treated him like any other passenger, because that's what he'd asked for in every word and gesture. When the plane touched down, rolling smoothly onto the tarmac, the cabin lights brightened. Passengers stretched, yawned, began pulling bags from overhead bins. Claire stood near the exit, ready to say goodbye. As the family approached, she met their eyes. Thank you for your understanding, she said to the daughters. One nodded. You're doing a hard job. We know that, the other added. Just remember, kindness doesn't have to mean saying yes. Claire swallowed. I will. Then the man paused in front of her. You'll do better next time, he said, not as a command but as a quiet belief. And somehow, that meant more than any reprimand ever could. They walked off the plane together, blending into the stream of deplaning passengers, just a father and his daughters heading home after a long day. No cameras, no crowd, just 3 people who'd held their ground with grace, and in doing so, reminded everyone around them what dignity really looks like. Back inside the emptying cabin, Claire took a deep breath. She wasn't the same person who'd boarded that plane hours ago. Something had shifted, not just in her, but in the air itself. Because sometimes change doesn't come with a speech or a protest. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the middle of the night on a routine flight, carried by a simple question. Why them? And the courage to finally ask it. The Los Angeles morning sun rose soft and golden over the tarmac, glinting off the wings of planes parked in neat rows. Inside the terminal, travelers streamed through the jet bridge, rolling suitcases behind them, blinking in the bright light after hours in the dim cabin. Among them, 3 figures moved without hurry, father and daughters, shoulders relaxed, voices low as they shared a quiet laugh about something only they understood. They didn't look back at the plane. They didn't pause for photos or autographs. To anyone watching casually, they were just another family reuniting after a trip, tired but glad to be home. But inside the aircraft they'd just left, the air still hummed with what had happened. Not with noise or drama, but with the kind of quiet reckoning that lingers long after the moment passes. Claire stood near the empty business class cabin, supervising the final cleanup. Her hands moved automatically, collecting stray blankets, checking seat pockets, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the last words the man had said to her. You'll do better next time. Not angry, not disappointed, just certain, and that certainty had settled deep in her chest, like a seed she hadn't known she needed. One of the other flight attendants, a veteran named Diane who'd been flying for 20 years, came up beside her. You okay? She asked, voice low. Claire nodded slowly. Yeah, just thinking. Diane didn't press. She'd seen it all, the good, the ugly, the moments that stick to your bones. That was something, she said finally. Not because of who they were, but because of how they handled it. Exactly, Claire said. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They just held their ground, and it made everything else look small. Diane sighed. We get trained to keep things smooth, avoid conflict, make the valuable customers happy. But nobody teaches us to ask, at whose expense? They stood in silence for a moment, watching the ground crew disconnect the jet bridge. Later that morning, before the crew even left the airport, an airline supervisor pulled Claire aside. Word had already reached corporate, not through social media, not through a complaint, but through a discreet call from a security detail that preferred quiet resolution over public spectacle. The airline wasn't being sued. There would be no headlines. But there would be a conversation. The supervisor, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, didn't scold. She simply said, We're grateful no one was hurt. But we're also grateful we got a chance to see where our policies fall short. By noon, an internal memo went out to all cabin crew on that route, effective immediately. Seat reassignments for upgrades would only be offered to passengers who volunteered. Never requested from specific individuals unless safety or operational needs required it. And unconscious bias refresher training would be added to the quarterly schedule, not as punishment but as practice. It wasn't a revolution. It was a course correction. Small, quiet, the kind that rarely makes news but changes lives all the same. Back in the city, the family had already slipped into their normal rhythm. Breakfast at a favorite corner cafe, a walk through a quiet neighborhood park. No press, no statements, just the ordinary comfort of home after travel. But the moment stayed with them, not as a wound but as a reminder. Over coffee, the older daughter said, It's strange, isn't it? How even now, after everything, people still assume we'll move quietly. Her father stirred his coffee slowly. It's not about us, really. It's about who the world expects to be flexible and who it assumes will hold firm. And we're supposed to be grateful just for being treated fairly, the younger sister added. Exactly, he said. But fairness shouldn't feel like a gift. It should be the baseline. They didn't plan to speak about it publicly. They'd learned long ago that not every injustice needs a spotlight to be real, and not every lesson needs an audience to matter. Sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply refusing to let someone else define your worth in a moment. Meanwhile, Mr. Reynolds returned to his office that Monday morning like nothing had happened. He sent emails, took calls, reviewed reports, but something nagged at him. A quiet unease he couldn't quite name. He replayed the flight in his head, the calm refusal, the way the cabin had shifted, the arrival of a man who hadn't raised his voice but had changed everything with 3 sentences. He told himself it was over. Just a bad night. But that week, when a junior colleague asked if he could use the conference room for a client meeting, Mr. Reynolds surprised himself by saying, "Sure, I'll find another spot." No argument. No reminder of seniority. Just a simple yes. He didn't connect the dots out loud. But somewhere deep down, a crack had formed in his certainty, and light was getting in. As for Mrs. Langley, the woman who'd offered her seat not out of obligation but principle, she wrote a short note to the airline a few days later. Not a complaint, not praise. Just a suggestion. Consider training your crew to recognize when accommodating one passenger means quietly burdening another. She signed it with her frequent flyer number and mailed it the old-fashioned way. The airline responded with a handwritten thank you and a voucher. But more importantly, they added her note to the training materials. Months passed. Seasons changed. The flight became just another entry in the logbook for most involved. But for those who were there, it remained a touchstone, a moment when ordinary people chose, in small ways, to see each other more clearly. Claire flew the same route again a few weeks later. This time, when a passenger asked if someone could switch seats for an upgrade, she smiled and said, "I'll put out a general call for volunteers. If someone's willing, great. If not, you'll have a perfectly comfortable seat right where you are." The passenger grumbled, but accepted it. And Claire didn't flinch. She'd learned something important. Service isn't about making powerful people comfortable. It's about treating everyone with equal care, especially those who don't demand it. Years later, when new flight attendants asked her for advice, she'd say, "Don't just look at who's speaking the loudest. Look at who's being asked to move the most. And ask yourself, why them?" Back in Washington, the sisters occasionally told the story. Not for sympathy, but as a teaching moment. To young interns, to friends, to anyone who assumed that privilege shields you from everyday slights. It's not about fame, one would say. It's about how people treat you when they think you won't push back. And their father, whenever he heard the story retold, would simply nod and say, "That's why we keep showing up, as ourselves. Not to prove a point, but to protect the space for others to do the same." The airline never released a public statement. There was no viral clip, no trending hashtag. But inside their training rooms, the incident became a case study, not labeled with names, but described simply as the seat request. New hires discussed it in small groups. What would you have done? How do you balance customer service with fairness? And every time someone would say, I'd ask myself, am I solving a problem or creating one for someone else? That was the real legacy of that flight. Not outrage, not punishment, but awareness passed quietly from person to person like a torch in the dark. Because change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It lives in a flight attendant's second thought, in a businessman's unexpected generosity, in two sisters who said no with grace, and a father who showed up not to rescue, but to stand beside them. And in the end, that's how dignity is preserved. Not through grand gestures, but through countless small choices to see each other fully, fairly and without assumption. The world kept turning. Planes kept flying. People kept boarding, hoping for smooth skies and kind treatment. And somewhere, on a routine flight across the country, a crew member paused before making a request and asked the right question first. That was enough.